All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to a very special edition of the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast. I am Brian Jester, co-founder, co-host here at Occupy Fantasy. We're joined today by a special guest, James McCool, aka at Paydirt DFS, at Paydirt_DFS on Twitter. What's happening, James?
What up, man? I'm doing pretty well. I'm just watching all the craziness of the stock market and relating it all to all the gambling that we all love and appreciate so much in the DFS space. So I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited for the Super Bowl. This should be a really, really good game from a real life standpoint, and probably something that we can leverage pretty well in DFS and especially in Showdown. So I'm doing pretty well, and I'm excited to be on the pod.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me. So, for those of you who don't know, James is the co-author of The Theory of DFS, theoryofdfs.com. He is the owner of paydirt.ghost.io, a company built on utilizing percentages and ranges of outcomes rather than the typical median projection model. He's also previously worked with Numberball, Daily Roto, and DraftKings Live. How's that for an intro, James? Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's pretty good, man. I have learned a lot in my journey over the last like 5-6 years in the DFS space. So I'm happy to be able to own my own space and like have my own spot for my projections and for all my crazy thoughts on leveraging 90% on players and all that kind of stuff, because that doesn't really fly when you're working for a larger company. So I'm happy to be able to have all this space and all these words in the space and the platform that I do.
Yeah, it definitely is a blessing to be able to get your words out there and your ideas out there, and to work for yourself like you do for your own site. So I want to get into some of your projections and how that relates to the Super Bowl, because for people who have listened to Occupy Fantasy's content, we're not huge on projections. Obviously, we use them in some sense, but we think that the field overvalues them in a majority of ways, and I think you would agree with that. But I would like to know, maybe not without getting too deep into the weeds or giving away your secret sauce, how do you, James, create NFL projections?
So I have a pretty simplistic view of projections in NFL. The way that I kind of look at different sports is we have sports that are kind of more linear. Things like NBA, you can consider kind of more of a linear projection sport where we can do a lot of calculations and the math is kind of nice, where we can take everything, we can take baselines and apply them to per minute projections, and then we can throw that into whatever minutes you have, if you have a minutes aggregate like I do, or if you have a system that is going to allow you to put in different minutes projections, and it's all just based on minutes. So as soon as you can get decent baselines and you can put them into a decent minutes projection, then you can have decent NBA projections. But when it comes to things like NFL, those are more event-based DFS sports, right? Where you don't have the luxury of being able to literally project something forward, because there are so many random events that happen in the middle of an NBA game or an NFL game or an MLB game or an NHL game, these event-oriented sports, that you can't really project that well. So I think the projections in NFL, I mostly agree with you that a lot of the field far overvalues projections in NFL and other event-oriented sports. So the way that I look at it is I take kind of more of a macro view of NFL, and I will take a baseline projection. And what I do is I run a simulation 5,000 times at the player level. So that's different from running at the game level like I do with MLB. And the difference is that we are projecting a player 5,000 times based on their baseline rates, but not necessarily in respect to the rest of the team. So it's kind of like an individual projection of each player. And I just do it based on baselines. I don't take hardly any defensive adjustments into account. I go basically a top-down model of looking at Vegas and breaking down the market shares of each player, developing a touchdown projection for each team, and then working backwards from there and applying it to different players. The pluses and minuses of that are kind of like nuanced, and some people like to take quarterbacks and work backwards from wide receivers. Some people like to project wide receivers based off of their quarterback, but I just take everything top down and apply based on baselines. And the reason for that is because I just don't think that getting super micro and like very granular on projections in NFL really does any good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the fact is, in 2021 now, the average player can go to any number of sites and get recently, pretty reasonable projections. And there's going to be some players that are off or different. Some sites are going to be higher on some players than the other. But we can go to anywhere in any of the free sources, honestly, and get pretty decent projections. Is what we do with those projections that matter. So how do you utilize your NFL projections for different DFS contest types, and maybe not showdown versus classic, but more so I'm thinking head-to-heads versus GPPs, and how are you using projections for those?
Well, if you've listened to the Theory of DFS masterclass, Jordan and I talk a lot about the difference between contest types and what you should be thinking about in cash games, what you should be thinking about in head-to-heads, double ups, triple ups, stuff like that, as opposed to what you should be doing in GPPs. Because there's a very large difference in the way that you need to be thinking about each different contest type and how you're applying projections. Because what projections are is a median outcome for a player. It is the thing that happens the most likely out of a million simulations. But we need to remember that each game that we are looking at, each instance, can be a different part of that simulation. So that's why I like to use a different range of outcomes for players. I like to know how often they hit certain thresholds rather than how often they hit that median threshold. But that median threshold is really, really useful in cash games, right? Because in cash games, you don't care about placing first. In fact, you shouldn't be trying to place first in a cash game. You should be trying to place like 50 or 45th percentile. You should be trying to place like 5% above the median outcome. So the best way to do that is just to use median outcomes and hope that other people make mistakes. That's the easiest way to really use projections, and where projections are the most useful, even in NFL. Because at their nature, they are a median outcome. That is what you're trying to hit in cash games. In double ups and head-to-heads, that's what you want to use projections for. When you start to get into things like triple ups or quad ups or like winner takes all and stuff like that, but are still small field contests, that's when you're going to start making like kind of a pivot here or there based on ownership. And I'm sure that we'll talk about leverage later on, because I know that you're really, really big on that. But when you are able to get leverage on a player while not changing your projection much, that's kind of where I think the projections still matter, is in those really small field contests, maybe less than 50 people. Because you don't want to be too far away from the median, but you also want to be able to get relative value. So you have to be able to make a pivot at one maybe semi-high owned player, or maybe the highest owned player on the slate, depending on what your models say. If my models say the highest owned player on the slate sucks, then I know that I'm either going to get first or last,
Those are the
right?
best slates, though.
Yeah, it is. No, it really, really is. Like if I have like I mean my models didn't say it, but if my model said that DeMarcus Cousins was projected for like 20 fantasy points 4 days ago and he was 90% owned, like that's a fun slate, but it will probably suck most of the time, right?
Yep.
But that's where projections matter, is in those smaller field contests. When you start getting into larger field contests, especially in NFL, you start kind of considering more of what the field is going to do. And you still want to have these players that project really, really well. Like I told my subs this last week for NFL that Travis Kelce, like you're just playing Travis Kelce. You can get your leverage elsewhere. You can get your differences elsewhere, because from a projection standpoint, you can't build a lineup that projects anywhere close to as well as if you have Travis Kelce, because the other tight ends projected for half of what his projection was. And when you have that large of a disparity at a position, especially on FanDuel, where positional scarcity actually matters a little bit, but on DraftKings for NFL, if you have a tight end that projects for 28 fantasy points and every other tight end projects for less than 12, you're just going to be different elsewhere. And you still have to regard projections in that way. For me, at least on a main slate, maybe on a showdown, I'll think a little bit differently. But even on a showdown, that if a player projects significantly higher than others, you probably are going to be able to get different elsewhere. But I guess what I'm trying to say is a smaller field contest projections matter more than a significantly larger contest, because the higher owned that your players have, and typically you're going to be having higher ownership on players that have better projections, the higher owned that player is, the harder it is to have a lineup that actually has enough relative value to take down a contest with 500,000 other people in it. So projections matter up to a point, and then when you get into these really, really large field contests, you're almost playing in a way that feels suboptimal, but if it goes your way, the payday is large enough to where it is optimal to play that way.
Right, for sure. Quick question: do you think that, especially for some of these larger sports, NBA, NFL, where we think projections are relatively efficient across the board, Do you think that someone could not have projections at all and just follow ownership as a way to try to beat that median outcome in smaller contests?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Actually, what I tell my subs to do is just play ownership in cash games.
There you
I
go.
mean, I like that. That's all you're doing. Well, because ownership, like you can treat cash games and you can treat double ups and head to heads as kind of like assessing market value, right? So why not just play the market? Why not just look at what everybody else wants to be playing and let other people make mistakes? I mean, everybody wants to play those other players because they are players that are valuable and probably rate well across the industry for one way or another.
Yep.
So in cash games head to heads, I just tell people to play the markets. And even in single entry, I think that people could do very well. And I know people do pretty well because my subs do pretty well with it, of playing a cash game lineup and just looking and saying, okay, what is the one or two players that are very highly owned that have other players in their price range that project just as well? And then just pivot. I don't think you really even need projections at this point because we can, if you are good enough at reading the market of ownership, and if you are good enough at reading a slate and saying, oh, well, Anthony Davis is out, like LeBron James is just like kind of a gimme in cash. And knowing kind of all of those different things as you practice and as you learn about the environment of DFS, projections are just kind of like they're almost a tiebreaker for me at this point. I don't really look at them as much to build my lineups anymore because I know that building a lineup is not about maximizing points. It's about maximizing my win probabilities and like how much I win when I actually do well.
It's a big difference, and a lot of people don't get that. A lot of casual players, especially, I'm trying to score as many points as possible when really your goal should be to maximize your win probability and your payout when you do win. So, well put, James. All right, so let's pivot to the Super Bowl a bit. I want to get your first thoughts when you found out that it was going to be Kansas City versus Tampa Bay. I know I had my immediate reactions, but from a showdown, maybe a betting perspective too, you find out these two teams are going to be on the slate. What was your initial reaction?
Uh, Only a little bit disappointed just because I wanted to be Packers Chiefs.
Mm,
I had kind of thought that it was going to be Packers Chiefs most of the year. And I didn't. I mean, Aaron Rodgers versus Patrick Mahomes is not any worse than Tom Brady versus Patrick Mahomes. This is going to be a fantastic real life game. But for DFS applications, Green Bay is a little bit nicer, right? Like that, especially from a showdown perspective of being able to look at it. And I'm sure that one of MVS or Alan Lazard was going to have higher ownership, and being able to have the lower owned one in showdowns would have been nice.
yep.
Knowing that there's a very, very, very skinny target tree on Kansas City, but with a couple guys that are viable in terms of like catching a deep touchdown, that is nice as well. Like you probably could have built unique lineups very easily and still had a lot of upside utilizing guys like Devontae Adams and Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill, while mixing in and out kind of these like more fringe guys that would have had some ownership disparities. So I would have liked that a little bit more. Tampa Bay, I think, makes for a better DFS kind of roulette almost in showdown, just because you do have both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and there's usually a disparity in ownership between those guys. And then Scotty Miller gets involved. We don't have like full news on Antonio Brown yet. There's always the Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette coin flip on that one as well. So I think that Tampa Bay is a bit more variant, and there's going to be different routes and a lot of more viability to kind of getting weird with that side of things. But I would have preferred Packers Chiefs from a DFS application.
Uh, I I think I definitely agree with you about the Buccaneers thing because I've lost so much money on Devontae Adams this year that I'm cool with him never being on another slate ever again. So the fact that the Packers didn't make it is good for my bankroll. So yeah, I'm kind of with you there. The interesting thing is obviously with Mahomes being on the slate and Kelsey being on the slate, that's two really high priced, really popular guys. And so that forces builds a lot of ways already in Showdown, which is a good and bad thing. If they hit, then it sucks for our lineups. But if in a good way, we're able to pivot off that and get some differentiated lineups. So you run your projections already for the Super Bowl. What is your first set telling you about how this game might go?
Well, Patrick Mahomes projects for around 27 fantasy points. That's his median. He is going to score 20 plus fantasy points 79% of the time. So there's still, that 21% margin where he is not going to be a great play, according to my models. Tom Brady projects for 24. He is 20 plus fantasy points 63.96% of the time. So when I'm looking at that, I think that Tom Brady probably ends up being less owned than Patrick Mahomes. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be pretty significant, in fact.
And he's cheaper, like by 2K on DraftKings. That's significant. I would rather go with Tom Brady at the very least over Patrick Mahomes, especially considering when we think about the way that these teams are kind of broken down in how the points are going to be distributed. The Chiefs, like, you could get by just going with Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill. And so I think that you can get a vast majority of the scoring and the fantasy upside by taking those guys with Tom Brady in Showdown. There's a lot of different ways to go about that. So I think that Patrick Mahomes, especially, one of my mantras is I try not to take the highest owned player if they are also the most expensive, because it forces you, like you said, to build a certain way. And if everybody else is also taking Patrick Mahomes, if 75% of the field has Patrick Mahomes at 12K, most expensive player on the slate, then 75% of the field is going to be building in a similar way to try to fit Patrick Mahomes in whatever way they have him, especially if they have him at captain. There's only going to be a couple ways that you can actually build with Patrick Mahomes at captain that are going to be viable and actually with enough upside to take down a GPP, much less be unique, right?
Yeah.
So Patrick Mahomes, as of now, probably an easier fade for me, but it also kind of depends on what else we see with, injuries and stuff like that. As of now, though, Tom Brady at 24 and Patrick Mahomes at 27, those are the two highest projected. Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce at 23 and 22 respectively, and then you drop down below guys who are underneath 20. But the projections match the DK pricing algorithm pretty well, so I think DraftKings did pretty well here. The only weird one is that I have Darrell Williams projected at 12 and CEH projected at 10. So that's kind of going to be an interesting one to look at as we get more news on Clyde Edwards-Helaire and what his workload should actually be like. If we have a lot of ambiguity with that situation, with that running back situation for Kansas City, there's probably going to be some upside to taking the one that's lower on there as well.
Yeah, and that's something I'm trying to figure out as well. And obviously, we still have 10 days until the Super Bowl, but I'm curious to see what the field is going to do there too, because a lot of times the field does side with the pricing. If Edwards-Helaire is more expensive than Darrell Williams, a lot of times he'll get that extra bump in ownership, and people will just assume that especially casual players, CEH is the guy that they want. And if you look at the final numbers from last week, it was a pretty split workload. But what was telling to me was the fact that CEH left the game in about mid-third quarter, and the game was relatively out of hand there, and he took a big hit right before there. Before that, the touches were split 2-1 in favor of CEH. So there are a lot of ways this plays out, and I think the best advice to give is to figure out what the field's going to do and just do the opposite. And then that's generally for some of these coin flip situations. So it's a really interesting situation. And so we had a segment planned here for the end, and we kind of talked about it already. This or that. We were going to name two players in this showdown slate, and you were going to pick one, and I was either going to play devil's advocate or agree with you on how we would play them in showdown. The first one was Brady versus Mahomes. So we talked about it a bit, but I would assume if you were choosing between the two, you would choose Brady at captain or flex based on what you just said.
Yeah, it's kind of, so I try to look at showdown. I don't know how you look at showdown, but I look at showdown as playing to circumstance. So I kind of want to try to think about how I think the game is going to play out, and then I want to build a lineup that benefits the most if I'm right about how that game plays out. So with this one, everybody automatically assumes shootout, and I'm in that group as well. I think this game should be a shootout, but if it's not, and we end up having the running backs be the ones that are the main players here, then we have to make the decision about quarterbacks at captain or not. Quarterback at captain actually has not been a super profitable thing this year. Even with some high scoring players, most of the time it's usually a wide receiver that ends up being the optimal captain and the one that takes down GPPs. So I don't know that I would use Tom Brady in the captain yet. Like we're still 10 days out. I haven't tried building yet, but at 10K, Tom Brady in the captain, I might want to go with one of his wide receivers instead, or I might want to go with Travis Kelce or something like that. But with Tom Brady versus Mahomes, yeah, the price drop. Tom Brady is way, way, way more attractive, especially because we think that he's going to be lower owned. He's cheaper. It allows for more diversification of builds so that you can have more unique lineups. It just would make more sense from a GPP perspective to take Tom Brady.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I actually run my own prop projections specifically for the Super Bowl because for those who've listened to this before, we go out to Vegas every year to bet on the Super Bowl props and things along those lines. And 2 years ago, when I won the Super Bowl Millie, our props projection system was telling us to just hammer the quarterback unders on both sides, Goff and Brady. Everything else was telling us that this game was probably going to go under the total. And for me, I hadn't max entered a ton up to that point, and I thought this was a good shot to take because Showdown was still pretty new, and the public and the average player was going to project and play this game as if it was going to score 55 plus points. And if I could get the Showdown edge with uniqueness and have a different game script than everyone, I thought that I would have a great chance at a high finish. Obviously, the absolute nuts happened, but I think it's a good way to look at it where if you think something, if a game is going to go way different than what the field expects, it's definitely something to jump on. Now, for me, I'm like you. I think this game also shoots out, and our early props projection system is also agreeing. So we're going to find different ways to get different. And maybe it's at the running back situation. We already talked about CEH versus Darrell Williams. What about Fournette versus Ronald Jones? Because this is an interesting backfield too.
God, yeah, this one is harder. Currently, I have Leonard Fournette leading it, right? Like I have Leonard Fournette projected for 16.61, Ronald Jones projected for 6.79. However, the pricing difference is massive between these dudes, right? Leonard Fournette at 7,800 and Ronald Jones at 2,200. Um, that's hard. That's a really, really hard choice. I think that people are going to go with Leonard Fournette because he was the main guy, but Arians really likes Ronald Jones, and apart from the last 2 weeks, Ronald Jones has mostly been the guy. And it was a weird signing of Leonard Fournette by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and nobody really understood it, and we still don't understand the split. But this one is absolutely going to come down to ownership, and I want to lean Ronald Jones just because he's so much cheaper. Still projects for 6.79, still gets a little bit of the red zone work, and it was dominating the red zone work earlier in the year. So I want to lean towards Ronald Jones, but this is a really, really hard situation. This is probably the hardest choice on the slate.
It is really tough because in the playoffs, Ronald Jones missed the first game with that random out of nowhere injury, but then the last two games, the workload on the ground has been roughly similar. Fournette leads slightly, but Fournette's had the big edge in the passing game. So with 2 weeks off and 2 weeks for Ronald Jones to fully recover, there's no real telling how this is going to shake out. We have an idea of how it's going to shake out, but it'll be interesting to see where the ownership goes because we've seen situations like this before where the cheaper running back has gotten a lot of ownership. I mean, Ronald Jones was like 45% on the two-game slate on FanDuel last week, and that surprised me as well. So I think there may be something out there that causes people to play Ronald Jones again in the Super Bowl, especially at these cheaper prices. So a cop-out answer here, but let's check back in on ownership in a week to see where people stand. What about these Tampa Bay receivers, Evans and Godwin? Our early prop projections are saying to bet the unders here, so I think I'll be less than the field on both of these guys. But if you're forced to choose one, good luck. But who would you pick, James?
I got to choose Mike Evans. And it's mostly just like people really like Chris Godwin, and he's more expensive, and I think that he's going to garner a lot more ownership. And Mike Evans dropped 3 passes that could have been touchdowns last week. And people just somehow, I don't really understand how, and this is why Josh Hermsmeyer has been like able to push the air yards model and like have it be so effective, and why it was such a game changer was because people just ignore when, and I know why it happens, but people ignore the drops. And I think people are going to ignore the drops on Mike Evans, and they're going to look at Chris Godwin's stat line last week, and they're going to say, oh, well, Chris Godwin should like be the guy again. He's Tom Brady's slot receiver, and that's historically been a popular thing. But Tom Brady still has a deep ball, and Mike Evans just dropped, I don't know, probably legit like 12 fantasy points last week. And they're the same price. I have them projected about the same. Chris Godwin at 19 and Mike Evans at 18. But when it comes to Showdown, when it comes to GPPs, I want ceiling. I don't want volume. I don't really care that much about volume. I want ceiling. So Mike Evans, 8,400. He's been the guy that Tom Brady has looked to in the red zone all year. He's been the guy who has been getting the deeper targets. He's been the guy who's been getting all of the value in the passing game, and I'll just ride that in the Super Bowl again.
Hard to argue with that. Plus, we're pretty much guaranteed a couple 1 yard targets from Evans around the goal line too, similar to
Yeah,
Devontae Adams. So certainly get that, and especially on FanDuel, I think you have to like Evans as well with his touchdown probabilities. All right, I think the most important spot on the slate is if you have to choose between the two, and I think most people will have to choose between the two, especially if you're playing on FanDuel, Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelsey. No positional requirements in showdown. So, what's your take on these two guys?
that's hard. And that's hard because there's no positional requirements. Like usually I can just cop out and be like, oh yeah, Travis Kelsey against all the other tight ends. Just play Travis Kelsey. But I can't do that here. Um, Travis Kelsey is more expensive, 11,000 versus 10.4 on DraftKings. Travis Kelsey projects at 22.2, Tyreek Hill at 23.7. It's mostly a coin flip situation. With situations like this, excuse me, situations like this, I try to think about what happens for each guy and where their fantasy points are going to come from. Tyreek Hill has had a good red zone presence most of the year, but Travis Kelsey has dominated kind of the middle of the field. And I try to think through what happens if this game goes a certain way. If we think this game is going to be a shootout, I kind of want to go with the Tyreek Hill side, just because I have this theory with Seattle and the way that I was deciding between um, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf was if it was going to be a shootout, I would want to choose Tyler Lockett because Tyler Lockett has the upside for the volume. If he gets a lot of volume, he's a good fantasy play. But if there's not really a lot of volume to be had, I think the DK Metcalf is a better play because he was running the routes that were of higher value if he was getting less targets. So I kind of look the same way as Travis Kelsey and Tyreek Hill in that regard, where I think that Tyreek Hill is going to thrive if there's a lot of passing in the game because he's going to be getting more targets and his value goes up with the amount of targets that he gets. Whereas Travis Kelsey gets fed regardless, and he's going to be getting high value targets down the middle of the field on the kind of routes that he runs. So with a situation like this where it's kind of like a coin flip between the projections and with the salary, like obviously if ownership comes in and we're seeing Tyreek Hill at like 29% and Travis Kelsey at like 75%, then yeah, just snap shove onto Tyreek Hill all in. But in a situation like this where I think that the ownership, all things are probably going to be equal, I want to bet on Tyreek Hill on getting up there on volume.
You know what? I think you might be surprised. I think we might have that snap shove situation because if we look at just some recent showdown slates, Kelsey's going to get there on ownership. He's going to be probably the second most popular guy, and Hill actually ends up getting the short end of the stick when that happens. And I
Ooh.
think we could legit see Hill get half of the captain ownership of Kelsey. Probably not half of the total ownership, but definitely a large discount from Kelsey. And believe me, like Adams, I've lost a shit ton of money fading Kelsey in showdown. And it seems like every single time his salary goes up, his production goes up with the ownership, and it just gets worse and worse. At some point, he's got to drop back a little bit, and maybe with 2 weeks to go, Tampa can figure out how to guard the guy. But I think at an ownership discount, Tyreek's going to be the play here. So what about these two defenses? If you're playing on DraftKings, defense comes into play. Generally, we see a high-scoring game like this. Both defenses come in under 10% projected ownership. So your thoughts on if either of these defenses can get there, how they do, and if you have a preference between the two?
So the way that I look at defense is I pretty much just want to know, usually on a full slate, I'll just try to pick a defense against a team that passes a lot. Because a team that passes a lot is inherently going to be dropping back a lot, and dropping back a lot is going to lead to opportunities for sacks.
Yep.
Especially if a team is going up against another team that is good on offense, then a team playing from behind that passes a lot is not only prone to more sacks, but also prone to more mistakes and interceptions and stuff like that. With a situation like this, I kind of have to default to how both quarterbacks act and what both quarterbacks want to do when they do drop back. Tom Brady with his 3 interceptions last week, whatever, man. I'm pretty much just gonna forget about that entirely because one of them was dumb as hell. Like that one where he just threw it up, falling backwards to Mike Evans, that one was stupid as hell. But the other ones, like whatever. I think that Patrick Mahomes is actually a lot more prone to sacks and more prone to interceptions because he does try to make more things happen when he's in the pocket. Sure, he usually gets away with it because he's a lizard person and he's insane. But like that kind of style of play, we see it a lot with Deshaun Watson, where Deshaun Watson, he takes sacks, and Russell Wilson, he takes sacks. Like those guys take sacks because they are mobile and they're trying to make things happen, but they're not idiots. They're not trying to throw the ball away. They're not trying to throw interceptions. So I'll default to Tampa Bay here just because I do think that Patrick Mahomes is more prone to mistakes and more prone to allowing a defense to find more upside. Um, but if you think that he's going to make enough mistakes to make a defense worth it, I don't really know how you build around that. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that because if you're building with a defense on this slate, like both of these quarterbacks are just going to keep going. And I don't know how you take defenses on this slate unless you're taking a running back captain from either side and just like trying to correlate that together. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways you could do it, and we've seen Tom Brady offenses this year put up 3 points, 1 or 2 touchdowns. Not saying it's going to happen in the Super Bowl, but that is in within the range of outcomes. Mahomes against the Falcons put up 17 points in Week 16 or whatever it was. So these are definitely within the ranges of outcomes. And if you're thinking about this, these guys still may continue to pass, or or maybe the game just stays close and low scoring this whole time, and neither team is taking that many chances. But the way you benefit is either one, like you said, playing the running back at captain, and hopefully they get most of the touchdown variance, or two, you could play high volume pass catchers, and maybe that's Godwin on this slate. Maybe that's Kelsey on the other side. I think those guys would make the most sense from a low scoring, get there on volume standpoint. But it is interesting, and I again, 600,000 players or however many is in the big DraftKings GPP, like a million on FanDuel. You have to get different in some way, and playing kickers or defenses that people aren't expecting to play, playing how the game is not expected to play out is really where all the value is on this type of slate. So, um, James, this was some great discussion. Really appreciated you coming on and talking about it. You have any final thoughts on the Super Bowl? I know we're still 10 days out, but any final thoughts or strategies or advice for people?
This should be a really, really good real life game. I don't watch sports in my spare time. I usually just kind of like watch championship games and stuff like that. I'm really, really excited for this one. Tom Brady, if you guys know me, I think he's the greatest quarterback alive that has ever been. Patrick Mahomes is the new GOAT. It's kind of the old GOAT versus the new GOAT with not only quarterbacks, right, with Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes, but also with Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelsey. So I think this is a really, really fun like Super Bowl, a really fun real life game, but it should be really, really cool for DFS as well. My main advice here, be unique. And I know that Brian tells you guys this all the time. It's his big thing, but be unique. The biggest thing in any showdown contest or any small slate contest, period, is being unique so that you have a chance to actually experience the expected value of your ticket. Like, if you are duping with other people, if you're just playing like the highest owned lineup, yeah, you might cash, but over time, you're not ever going to actually make that money up. So be unique. And most of all, like have fun. I mean, if you're building a lineup for the showdown, unless you're max entering, if you build like one lineup, you should build something that like is unique and is the most fun for you to sweat out because it's the freaking Super Bowl and it's the last slate that we get, and like have some fun with it before you have to tilt MLB for the next 6 months.
Yeah, before you stack the A's 15 days in a row, and yeah, definitely have been there before. And yeah, I mean that's a great point, right? And if you're making one or two lineups, you probably don't want to root for the 7-3 Super Bowl, right? You don't want to
No,
root for a defense in your lineup with a running back captain. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If you're making just one or two lineups, enjoy the game too. I mean that's a reason we play. Obviously, we want to make money, but we also play this to enjoy the game as well. So, all right, James, before we get out of here, tell the people what you're working on, where they can find you.
I am doing all sorts of cool things over at paydirt.ghost.io. I'm building an optimizer right now. It is up on beta form right now. So subscribers can play around with it and let me know everything that's terrible about it so I can fix it. I also am, like I said, the co-author of The Theory of DFS. You can find that over at www.theoryofdfs.com/masterclass. 15-hour audio master course that teaches you everything that you need to know about being a profitable DFS player. So those are my two big main things. But most of all, I'm just having a good time and shorting stocks.
Sounds good. Appreciate it, James. Thanks for coming on. For those of you still listening, be sure to subscribe, whether you're watching this on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. We'll have a couple more Super Bowl edition podcasts coming out shortly. We have a couple more guests coming on. We'll have our mega Super Bowl props edition and then one big showdown edition as well. You can follow us at Occupy Fantasy on Twitter. You can follow me at Brian Jester FF. You can follow James at paydirt_DFS. So for James, I'm Brian. Thanks for listening. Good luck in the Super Bowl, and we'll talk to you soon.